Everybody, it is 521, week number 6. This week we are focusing on another one of our subgroups. And if we take just a step back, one of the learning outcomes of this whole course is to be able to examine and engage around equity, around assistive technologies. It's always with assistive technologies for students in these kind of specific groups. So we've looked at students with special needs, English language learners or emerging bilingual students, students with physical disabilities, students that are socioeconomically disadvantaged, fostered youth. This week is around closing the achievement gap, and I have some thoughts. There's been a considerable amount of work around what that means and a lot of inherent bias with the term achievement gap. So if you've not heard about this before, stay with me because I think it really frames the discussion board post of this week. You're going to be reading an article that really summarizes some empirical research looking at school-based strategies to close the achievement gap in schools, and then comes up with recommendations for educators and policymakers. But the problem with achievement gap is that it talks about the symptoms of an issue and it doesn't talk about the cause of the issue. And just the name of it so it really bothers me because it's less about achieving, which puts the onus on students for not achieving well, and less on the underfundedness often of their schools. And so a lot of what people are talking about instead of just achievement gap is an opportunity gap or an education debt. And what those two latter things do is puts the focus on the causes of why schools are performing lower than other schools. And just the whole idea of a gap is an invented thing. The gap of what? Of the thing that we imagined students should be. You should be here. Why? Because policymaker decided that. That's the thing, and you are not there. Um, but it's really often what you will see in these schools that are performing below expectations is that there's a lot of things that are in the way of that student and of those educators at that school that are preventing the way. So funding is a big thing, economic inequality, parents that right along with that that are having to work multiple jobs. As I've talked in other videos, students that don't have their own bedroom, let alone their family having their own house or their own apartment, having to share apartments, having to be unhoused. Like all of these things make massive impacts in how students learn and perform on tests. If you're unhoused, I would imagine a standardized test is not number one priority for you right now. Um, and so looking at that, I mean, just that's kind of just the economic part of it. Often there's a lot of baked in structural racism in play, and we don't need to jump too much in that, but I think it's important to name that it's not just achievement gap. These students don't work as hard or don't um, there's a lot of ways I've heard it described where achievement gap makes it about the outcome and less about what the problem is. And um, while this can be useful in a number of ways of looking at some of the data um, and come up with actual strategies that help, which often do help, it's also, right, both things are going to be true. It's also important to look at this critically and think what data is missing because that is never mentioned in articles like this or in research like this. Um, do we talk about how those disparities were created or how they are perpetuated? Um, and then the other question to ask, and this is just kind of good critical thinking with all reading, but in articles like this, we tend to not talk about it in terms of that who benefits from framing it as this way of this is an achievement gap, um, and makes it less about the policymakers and how they do and don't fund schools, and more about parents and students. And very quickly, right there are the teachers who aren't performing at the level of expectations when it's really about an opportunity gap created by policymakers and about funding and lack of funding. Um, I mean, this is one of those things like we're in in-person class, we could talk about this for like 3 hours and like really get into it. So try your best in this discussion board to really look at it from a more holistic way and don't necessarily buy the narrative of the authors that this is a gap and students and teachers are to blame. Um, and both things are true. There are ways that schools can improve. There are ways that teachers can be better. My goodness, like you're in grad school right now, working to improve and be a better teacher. And so in a year, hopefully, like you're going to be a better teacher than you were right now. And so it's also important to look at pieces of research like this and see how can we be better? How can we improve? What is the data telling us, and then how can we make choices that will improve the data, but also like improve student learning, improve like schools in general. Um, yeah, that's discussion board number one. The You're going to continue reading, by the way, with Dell chapters 13 and 14. Keep going with that. The big thing you have this week is a survey. You're going to be doing that in Google Forms. The Google Doc with the assignment walks it through pretty straightforward. And essentially, you're going to share out a form, make sure to follow what the rubric and Google Doc share. I'm not going to say all of it out loud because you'll just read it anyway. Make sure to hit all of those points. And in my opinion, from what I've heard from previous students, there's kind of two parts to this of kind of where the effort's going to be. It's going to be getting people to actually fill out the survey. So you might need to be calling in some favors from some colleagues, being like, please, 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 I need more people to fill this out, even if it's kind of quick. Please, please, please fill it out. That's going to be the first kind of big hoop to jump through to get this assignment done. And then the second part is to make sure you actually do the reflection, because often I find when I do projects like this, I'm like, oh, it's a survey. I did the survey. And like ready to submit. I'm like, wait, I didn't look at the rubric. I'm looking at the rubric, survey and reflection. Those are 15 points each. So please, please, please don't forget the reflection. Um, that is all for week 6. It's a pretty straightforward week. If you want to look ahead into week 7 and 8, you have a big assignment coming up at the end of week 8, your school equity reflection paper. So maybe take a quick look at that, see where we're headed with that, because in week 7, we only have a discussion board. There's not an assignment. So assignment this coming week, week 6, and then that very last day of class, week 8, is your final uh, equity paper. So that is all for this week. If you have questions, please reach out. And happy week 6, everybody.